The German Luftwaffe began the war with a specific obsession, the Zerstörer, destroyer. This was the concept of the heavy fighter. Hermann Göring and the German High Command believed that single-engine fighters, like the Bf-109, were too short-ranged and lightly armed to dominate the airspace over a continent. They envisioned a twin-engine heavy fighter. Fast, long-ranged, and packed with heavy cannons. It would be a cruiser of the sky. It would destroy enemy bombers and brush aside enemy fighters through sheer firepower. The first attempt, the Messerschmitt Bf-110, had been a disappointment during the Battle of Britain. It was too sluggish to fight the Spitfires. But by 1943, the strategic situation had changed. The threat was no longer British fighters, it was American bombers. Massive formations of B-17 Flying Fortresses and B-24 Liberators were pounding German industry in daylight. These bombers were heavily armed porcupines, bristling with .50 caliber machine guns. A standard Bf-109 had to get dangerously close to shoot one down. The loss rates among German single-engine pilots were climbing. The Luftwaffe needed a standoff weapon. A plane that could carry heavy rockets and massive cannons to break up the bomber formations from a safe distance. They dusted off the Zerstörer concept. And they introduced its ultimate evolution, the Messerschmitt Me for 10 Hornisse, Hornet. It was a sleek, menacing machine. It had two powerful Daimler-Benz engines. It had a glazed nose that gave the crew incredible visibility. It featured innovative remote-controlled defensive gun turrets on the sides of the fuselage. On paper, it was the perfect bomber killer. It was fast enough to catch the B-17s. It was heavy enough to carry an arsenal that could blow a bomber out of the sky with one hit. The German crews assigned to the Zerstörer destroyer wings felt elite. They believed they had the technological answer to the American terror bombers. They believed they were the sharks, and the B-17s were the whales. They didn't realize that they were about to enter a pool with a much faster, much deadlier shark. The confidence of the Me for 10 crews was based on a single strategic assumption: the fighter gap. In 1943, Allied fighter escorts had a limited range. The Spitfires could barely cross the English Channel. The P-47 Thunderbolts, before they got drop tanks, could only reach the German border. This meant that for the majority of their mission, flying deep into central Germany to bomb factories in Schweinfurt, Regensburg, or Berlin, the American bombers were alone. They were naked. The German defensive strategy was built around this gap. They would let the American fighters turn back at the border. They would wave goodbye to them. Then, once the little friends were gone, the big friends belonged to the Luftwaffe. This was the hunting ground of the Me for 10. Operating deep inside German airspace, the Me for 10 crews didn't have to worry about dogfighting. They didn't have to worry about P-47s or Spitfires diving on their tails. They were operating in a sanctuary. Their only enemy was the slow, lumbering bomber stream. This allowed the Germans to overload the Me for 10 with heavy weapons. They added armor plate. They added rocket tubes. They added heavy cannons. The plane became heavier and less agile, but it didn't matter. You don't need to be agile to attack a bus. The German pilots developed a sense of safety. They believed the laws of physics prevented a single-engine Allied fighter from carrying enough fuel to reach Berlin. They laughed at the idea. A fighter over Berlin? Impossible. This arrogance led them to design a plane that was a specialist. A sniper. But a sniper is helpless if someone runs up to him with a knife. The Me-10 was built for a war where the enemy fighters stayed home. It was a magnificent design for a specific set of circumstances. But in war, circumstances change. And when they change, specialists die. The Me-10 was not just a plane, it was a flying artillery battery. The standard armament was impressive, 2 20mm cannons and 2 machine guns in the nose. But the Astoria units wanted more. They wanted a weapon that could kill a P-17 from outside the range of the American .50 caliber defensive guns, about 1,000 yards. German engineers fitted the Me-10 with the Bordkanone 5, BK-5. This was a 50mm cannon. It was essentially a Panzer III tank gun, modified with an automatic loader and stuffed into the nose of an airplane. It was a monstrosity. The barrel protruded feet ahead of the cockpit. It fired a shell the size of a milk bottle. A single hit from a 50mm high-explosive shell would disintegrate a bomber. It would tear a wing off. It would shatter the fuselage. The Me-10 pilots practiced sniping. They would fly behind the bomber formation, staying 1,500 yards away, safely out of reach of the American gunners. They would look through a telescopic sight. Thump! 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 The big gun fired slowly. The recoil shook the entire airframe. But when it connected, the results were catastrophic. They also carried Werfer 21, WGR-21 rockets. These were massive 21 cm mortar rockets launched from tubes under the wings. They were inaccurate, but they had a time fuse. The Me-410s would fire a salvo into the tight American combat box formation. The rockets would explode like huge flak shells in the middle of the bombers. The shockwaves and shrapnel would break up the formation. Damaged bombers would fall out of line. Once a bomber was isolated, the Me-410s would swarm it like piranhas, finishing it off with their cannons. For the crews, this was a feeling of immense power. They were engaging the enemy on their own terms. They were inflicting massive damage while staying relatively safe. The Me-10 seemed to be the ultimate solution. It was the bomber-destroyer they had dreamed of. They painted a victory marks, silhouettes of B-17s, on their rudders. The tallies grew quickly. They thought they had won the technological war. The high-water mark for the Me-10 and the Astoria concept came in late 1943. The raids on Schweinfurt and Regensburg. The U.S. 8th Air Force launched massive daylight raids deep into Germany to destroy the ball-bearing factories. As soon as the American P-47 escorts turned back at the German border, the slaughter began. The Me-410s rose to meet the bombers. They formed up in lines at the rear of the American formation. They looked like executioners lining up a firing squad. They launched their rockets. The sky filled with black puffs of smoke. American bombers rocked and scattered. Then the Me-410s closed in with their cannons. American gunners fired back desperately, but their bullets fell short. They watched helplessly as the twin-engine German fighters sat just out of range and picked them apart. B-17s exploded. Wings spiraled down. Parachutes filled the sky. The losses were staggering. The U.S. Air Force lost 60 bombers in a single day. That's 600 men. Another 100 bombers were damaged so badly they were scrapped upon return. It was an unsustainable rate of attrition. The German pilots landed, exhilarated. They had broken the back of the American offensive. They believed they had proven that daylight bombing was impossible without escort. And since they believed long-range escort was impossible, they thought they had won the air war. General Gull and the Luftwaffe leadership congratulated the Me-51 crews. They called the Me-51 the backbone of the Reich defense. They ordered production increased. They moved more Astoria units to the west. They were doubling down on a strategy that worked perfectly in a vacuum. But the vacuum was about to be filled. While the Germans celebrated their victory at Schweinfurt, American engineers were fitting a Merlin engine and an 85-gallon fuselage tank into a P-51 Mustang. The Me-51 crews were the kings of the sky for a few short months. But a new king was coming. And he was faster, angrier, and he didn't care about the German border. Early 1944. Deep over Germany, a flight of Me-410s is stalking an American bomber formation near Brunswick. The German pilots are relaxed. The P-47s turned back an hour ago. They are in the safe zone. Oberleutnant Hans Weber, composite character, is lining up a BA-17 in his telescopic sight. He is ready to fire his 50mm cannon. He checks his rearview mirror out of habit. He expects to see empty sky, or perhaps his wingman. Instead, he sees a glint of sunlight. A silver shape is diving on him from high above. It is small. It has a single engine. It has a radiator scoop under the belly. It is a P-51 Mustang. The realization hits Weber like a physical blow. Indians at 6 o'clock, he yells over the radio. Fighters! American fighters! His squadron mates are confused. Impossible! We are too deep. But the tracer fire whipping past their canopies is real. The P-51 Mustang had arrived. With its internal fuselage tank and external drop tanks, it could fly to Berlin, fight for 20 minutes, and fly home. The fighter gap had been closed overnight. For the Me-51 crews, this was a catastrophe. Their aircraft was designed to fight bombers. It was heavy with armor, rockets, and the massive cannon. It was not designed to fight the most agile fighter of the war. The hunter had instantly become the prey. Weber abandons his attack on the bomber. He jams the throttle forward. He tries to dive away. The Me-51 is fast, but it cannot outdive a Mustang. He tries to turn. The heavy, twin-engine plane banks sluggishly. The Mustang, light and nimble, cuts inside his turn effortlessly. The American pilot is on his tail, closing to point-blank range. The 6.50 caliber machine guns of the Mustang open up. The Me-51 shudders as the bullets tear through its wings and fuselage. The sanctuary of the Reich defense is gone. The sky over Germany is now a death trap for the heavy fighter. The first encounters between the Me-51 and the Mustang were a brutal lesson in aerial physics. It was a classic mismatch, weight versus lift. The Me-10 pilot had two choices when attacked: run or turn. Both were suicidal against a Mustang. If the Me-10 tried to run, it was limited by its weight and drag. It could reach about 390 miles per hour at altitude. The Mustang, powered by the Packard V1650 Merlin engine and utilizing its laminar flow wing, could exceed 430 miles per hour. The Mustang would simply run it down. If the Me-10 tried to turn, it was worse. The Me-10 was heavy. To turn a heavy plane tightly required enormous amounts of lift, which meant it bled off speed rapidly. It wallowed in the air. The Mustang had a low wing loading. It could turn tightly and maintain its energy. A P-51 pilot could easily stay behind an Me-10, no matter how hard the German pilot pulled on the stick. The Me-10 pilots were used to fighting B-17s that flew straight and level. Now, they were fighting a plane that could dance around them while they were trying to turn a bus. The psychological impact was devastating. The Me-10 crews felt helpless. They were flying a sophisticated machine that was completely useless in the environment it now found itself in. They had been trained to be snipers. Now they were being forced into a knife fight, and they were bringing a bazooka. The Luftwaffe leadership was slow to react. They couldn't believe their vaunted Astoria were being slaughtered so easily. They told the pilots to be more aggressive, to use their rear gunners. But aggressiveness doesn't change the laws of aerodynamics. The German engineers knew the Me-10 was not a dogfighter. They had tried to give it defensive teeth. The Me-10 was fitted with a technological marvel, remote-controlled defensive armament. On the sides of the rear fuselage were two barbettes, streamlined pods, each containing a 13mm machine gun. These weren't manned by a gunner in a turret. They were aimed remotely by the radio operator, who sat facing backward behind the pilot. He looked through a periscopic sight. He used a pistol grip controller to slew the guns and fire them. It was very advanced. It was very German. And it was almost totally useless in a dogfight. The system was designed to defend against a fighter approaching slowly from the dead 6 o'clock position. But the Mustangs didn't attack like that. They attacked in high-speed slashing dives from above, or tight deflection shots from the side. The Mustang would flash past the Me-10 at a relative speed of 300 miles per hour. The German radio operator couldn't track it. The motors moving the barbettes were too slow. The periscopic sight field of view was too narrow. He would be desperately swinging the controller around, trying to find the silver blur that was tearing his plane apart. By the time he got the guns aimed, the Mustang was gone, repositioning for another pass. Furthermore, the guns were only 13mm heavy machine guns. They lacked the hitting power to stop a Mustang quickly unless they got a lucky hit on the pilot or engine. The American pilots quickly learned to ignore the rear guns. They treated them as a nuisance, not a threat. The high-tech defense system was a failure. It added weight and complexity but provided no real protection against a modern fighter. The German crew was trapped in a glass coffin, watching their death approach while their high-tech gadgets whirred uselessly. The end of the Me-10 as a viable weapon came in late February 1944. Big week. The Allies launched a massive, sustained bombing campaign against the German aircraft industry. They flew every day, regardless of weather. And for the first time, they had enough Mustangs to provide continuous escort all the way to the targets and back. The Luftwaffe rose to defend the Rye. They sent everything they had. The Zastora wings took off, expecting another Schweinfurt. They expected to find unescorted bombers. Instead, they flew into a trap. The American fighter commanders had changed their tactics. They didn't just stick close to the bombers. They unleashed the Mustangs. General Jimmy Doolittle ordered his fighters to go hunting. Pursue and destroy the enemy wherever you find him. The Mustang squadrons roamed far ahead of the bomber streams. They intercepted the German formations while they were still assembling. The Me-10 units were caught climbing, heavy with fuel and rockets. They were moving slowly. It was a massacre. Hundreds of P-51 swooped down on the clumsy twin-engine fighters. The sky over Germany was filled with burning Me-410s. Entire squadrons were wiped out in minutes. One Me-10 unit, ZG-26, lost 17 aircraft in a single engagement. The German pilots were overwhelmed. They couldn't fight back. They couldn't run. The big weak battles broke the back of the Zastora force. The loss of aircraft was bad, but the loss of experienced crews was catastrophic. These were men who had trained for years. They were specialists. They couldn't be replaced. After Big Week, the Luftwaffe High Command realized the truth. The Zastora concept was dead. You cannot fly a heavy fighter in airspace you don't control. The Me-10, the plane that was supposed to be the savior of Germany, had become a liability. The American Mustangs had not just shot down planes, they had destroyed an entire strategic doctrine. The final indignity for the Me-10 crews was the unreliability of their primary weapon. The BK-5 50mm cannon was a magnificent piece of artillery, but it was a terrible aircraft gun. It was complex. It had a large, intricate automatic loading mechanism that fed the heavy shells into the breech. It was designed to operate in the stable environment of a tank on the ground. In the air, it was subjected to freezing temperatures, high G-forces, and violent vibrations. It jammed constantly. Imagine the situation of a Me-10 pilot. He has survived the Mustang attacks. He has managed to get into position behind a B-17 formation. He is looking through his telescopic sight. The bomber fills the crosshairs. He presses the firing button. Clunk! Nothing happens. The gun has jammed. A shell is stuck in the feeder. The pilot is now flying a heavy, slow, unarmed aircraft right behind a bomber formation bristling with machine guns. He cannot clear the jam in the air. The mechanics have to do it on the ground. He is defenseless. His only option is to break away, dive, and head for home, hoping no Mustangs see him. German pilots reported that the gun jammed on as many as 40% of their sorties. They cursed the weapon. They called it the flying junk pile. They had sacrificed speed and agility for firepower, only to find that the firepower wasn't there when they needed it. The failure of the BK-5 was symbolic of the entire German war effort in the later years, high-tech concepts that failed in the rugged reality of combat. They were trying to win the war with wonder weapons that didn't work, while the Americans were winning it with reliable, mass-produced machines that did. For the American Mustang pilots, the Me-10 became the preferred target. It was large. It was slow, relatively. And it was packed with flammable materials. The Me-10 carried huge amounts of fuel in its wings to give it range. It carried hydraulic fluid for its complex systems. It carried rocket propellant and heavy cannon shells. It was a flying gas station. When a Mustang pilot lined up on a Me-10, he didn't have to be a sharpshooter. The target was big enough to fill his gun sight easily. He would open fire with his 6.50 caliber machine guns. The sort effect of the converging bullets would tear into the Me-410 structure. Gun camera footage from the period shows Me-410s disintegrating under fire. Engines would burst into flame. Wings would snap off. The glass nose would shatter. It wasn't a dogfight, it was an execution. American pilots called them flying barns or meat on the table. The disparity in performance was so great that it felt unfair. A rookie Mustang pilot on his first mission could shoot down a veteran Me-10 crew simply because his plane allowed him to do things the German plane couldn't. The morale of the Me-10 units collapsed. Pilots would find excuses not to fly. They would claim mechanical problems. They knew that going up in that plane against the Mustangs was a death sentence. The Hunter had been completely reduced to a target. By the summer of 1944, the Luftwaffe High Command finally accepted reality. The Astoria units were withdrawn from the Western Front. They could no longer operate in the face of Allied air superiority. The remaining Me-410s were sent to the Eastern Front or used for night reconnaissance, where they had a better chance of survival. But the concept of the daylight heavy fighter was dead. It died over the skies of Germany, killed by the P-51 Mustang. The graveyard of the Astoria idea was filled with the twisted wreckage of Bf-110s and Me-410 scattered across Europe. It was a costly strategic error. Germany had poured immense resources, aluminum, engines, pilots, and fuel into a weapon system that was fundamentally flawed. They had built a plane for a war that didn't exist anymore. They assumed the enemy would stand still and let them shoot. They didn't anticipate an enemy that could outfly them. The failure of the Me-10 was a microcosm of the failure of the Luftwaffe. They were reactive, not proactive. They built defenses against yesterday's threat, while the Allies were building weapons for tomorrow's war. The heavy fighter was a dinosaur, and the Mustang was the asteroid that wiped it out. The final months of the air war over Europe were a procession of Allied dominance. Massive formations of B-17s and B-24s droned over Germany, their silver wings gleaming in the sun. And around them, weaving contrails in the high blue sky, were the Mustangs. They were everywhere. There were no Me-410s waiting to ambush the bombers. There were hardly any German fighters at all. The Luftwaffe had been beaten into the ground. The Mustang had done its job. It had cleared the skies. The American bomber crews, looking out their windows, felt a profound sense of relief. They knew that little friends were there. They knew that the days of the Schweinfurt slaughter were over. The P-51 Mustang hadn't just shot down planes, it had enabled the strategic bombing campaign to continue. It had opened the door for D-Day by destroying the Luftwaffe's ability to interfere. The story of the Me-10 and the Mustang is the story of technological leapfrog. Germany built a hammer to smash a rock. America built a rapier to parry the hammer and kill the wielder. The war was won by the side that could adapt, the side that could project power over distance, and the side that realized that in the air, agility and range are the ultimate weapons. The Me-10 Hornisse was a formidable stinging insect. But the P-51 Mustang was the DDT that cleared the swamp.